Hi there, and welcome to my next lecture. This one's called New Directions in Wine, and it's really taking all of the stuff that we know is happening, some of which, frankly, has been happening for a fairly long time. But we're going to look at where it's going to go from here, what the status is, and again, this is a constantly evolving field, so lots of stuff I'm going to talk about today. Who knows, tomorrow there may be a new development, but it'll be fun to at least see where some of this stuff can go, and I hope it gives you some ideas for where you might go with your work. First of all, of course, there's a big discussion these days about how natural and healthy wine is. You've seen some stories about the health impacts from wine. Most of the studies I've seen, by the time you get through, all of the information says, frankly, wine's good for some things, not so good for other things, and if it were a new drug brought on to, or a new product brought onto the world market today, it would probably be a wash into whether it's good for you or not good for you. Obviously, in moderation, the odds go up in favor of being good for you, but of course we can't talk about wine without talking about those people who drink it not in moderation, and then it's a deadly drug. So, mixed bag. But in the meantime, a lot of consumers are interested in healthy, organic. We've seen an explosion in everything from gluten-free products to vegan products, etc. Let's talk through these various concepts in terms of how they deal with wine. Is it a healthy product? One of the things you have to be very careful of in the world of wine is making any health claims at all on your labels or on your marketing materials. Years and years ago, Robert Mondavi had his winery slapped on the wrist for claiming that wine is part of a healthy and natural lifestyle. Apparently the word healthy did not meet with governmental approval because they weren't willing to grant that wine is healthy. Go figure. But on the other side of that, there are now wineries that are starting to list nutritional or ingredient labeling the same way that you find it on the box of cereal or a loaf of bread or anything else. People want to know how many calories in this glass of wine, 100 to 150. They want to know, does it have salt? No. Does it have gluten? No. Is it vegan? Depends on how it's made. But they want this information. Sometimes some consumers really view this as full transparency and full explanation of how you make the product. On the other hand, we in the wine industry have often taken the position it's a natural product, it's grapes, it's yeast, and that's about it. And so then we decide, well, okay, so we don't need to explain that. Except that, of course, there are people who are producing wines that claim that many of the major wines are overly manipulated and there are 150 different chemicals that you can add to wine. Not technically true, or maybe technically true, but not practically true. So let's talk about that next element. What does natural mean? There is a big boom in the so-called natural wine business amongst small restaurants in New York. It is not clear that that big boom exists anywhere other than in a very few small markets. And there are no, for example, big national natural brands. By definition, natural wine cannot be a major brand because it has to be produced in very small quantities under very, frankly, very rigid conditions. It would be interesting to see what happened if Gallo decided they were going to make a natural wine. They could probably do it there. But there is no definition for natural. It generally is used to mean minimal intervention from the winemaker. But of course, what does minimal intervention mean? The winemaker decides when to pick the grapes. That's intervention. The winemaker decides, in some ways, does he decide what temperature? Does he pick today or does he pick tomorrow? Not because the grapes will be a little riper tomorrow, but it's going to be colder tomorrow and the fermentation would be cooler. That's a decision by the winemaker that ultimately affects the character of the wine. So we go from those very minimal things to, does the wine go into oak? Isn't that intervention? Wouldn't a pure wine be made in stone or in stainless steel, which has no interaction with the wine? To then we get to, obviously, very large brands that build wines from multiple sources, and when the vintage is inconsistent, they use everything from blending previous vintages and grapes from different areas to grape concentrate, which is basically mega red and mega purple, to other things to make sure their wine is consistent. What does natural mean today? There's no definition. For some people, it means pure and healthy. For others, it means defective and problematic. And I suspect this is not a situation that's going to go away soon. But most Americans have a tendency to think that at least in smaller quantities and at least at higher prices, wine is basically a natural product. Everyone will express at some point or another a basic concern about those huge wineries that produce very inexpensive wine, and they must be doing something illegal or at least chemical. Ironically, because those big wineries draw on vineyard sources from all over the state and a vast supply of wine that they can blend, they probably have to use less chemical alteration to their wines because they can simply do that by blending different lots together. There are theoretically vegetarian and vegan options to wine. There are some wineries that use, for example, egg whites to fine the red wines. They use isinglass, which is a part of a fish, to limit or delete the proteins from a wine. But in general, most wine is kind of vegan depending on what kind of filtration they use. And by the way, all wine is gluten-free. You can drink it just as much as you'd like. Maybe the next category we should talk about is what does sustainable mean? Again, a word that has no real definition. Now, that's a little unfair because there are a number of organizations who define what sustainability actually is. I was part of the original process out in Lodi, 20 plus years ago, to define the Lodi rules, which are pretty much the guidelines for all sustainable farming in the New World. And they basically say you won't use any chemicals more than you have to. Limiting the use of chemicals is, of course, the primary goal of sustainability, because the goal is that you should be able to continue to do this for a long time. Anything you take out of the land, you are able to put back into it and keep the land itself healthy. And for example, you've got Napa Green. It's a similar sort of guidelines, very much based on Lodi. Fish-friendly farming, another one that not only addresses all of the practices in the vineyard, but even addresses things like soil erosion, because of course fish depend on clean water in order to live, so that fish-friendly farming also involves erosion control and all the rest. So there are a bunch of different ways to define sustainability. These days, I think most people would argue that winemakers are trying to become more sustainable. Many of them would meet a generic standard of sustainable. A lot of that simply has to do with the fact that a lot of these non-sustainable practices are economically non-sustainable. They cost a lot of money. And so the goal is, if we can reduce our costs by using fewer products, we will become more sustainable, both on an agricultural basis, but also on an economic basis. So the challenge, of course, is that consumers in America do not understand the difference between healthy, natural, sustainable, or either of the next two terms. Then we have organic products. Organic products are very rigidly controlled by FDA guidelines. Only organic materials may be used in the vineyard, for example. So you cannot use geophosphates. You must use sulfur to reduce mildew in your vines. Now, one of the challenges with that is that there are commercially acceptable chemical non-organic treatments for mildew that are much more effective than sulfur. You can eliminate mildew with sulfur, given the right weather conditions, but you need to drive your tractor through the vineyard considerably more often in order to do that. So is organic by definition healthier for the environment than people who are farming not organically? It's not always true. It's not always the case. There are, in every scenario like this, there are different ways to look at it. Another way to identify this, or to think about this, is they can only use organic products. But remember, uranium, that's organic. So too much sulfur in a wine will have some negative impacts on the wine. The guidelines are clear. You do have to file an extensive amount of paperwork. And so there are many wineries, at least in the New World, who claim we would be organic, except we can't be bothered to file the paperwork. Of course, there's no way of verifying that claim, so we don't know if it's true. But there you go. And then the final element of this is organic grapes versus organic wine. You can make a wine from organic grapes and still use certain chemicals in the winery to make sure things are clean. The wine would not be organic, but it can be made from organic grapes. So again, just another terminology war that, frankly, in the long run, simply confuses consumers more than it does anything else. And then the last category is biodynamic. This is founded by a guy by the name of Rudolf Steiner, who was an absolute visionary and an absolute whack job. It is as much a religious treatise as it is a farming manual, and he has a whole series of things you need to do each month in order to maintain the integrity of your farm. And basically, the concept is a simple one, and it's adorable one, I guess is the way I would put it, which is that your farm should become a self-sufficient ecosystem. That means nothing added from outside the farm, nothing taken away from the farm that can't be replenished by the farm's natural processes. Great idea. Works probably pretty well if you are in a relatively biodiverse farming community in a relatively rich agricultural region. That's probably pretty reasonable. When you start growing grapes in the Atacama Desert in Chile, when you start growing grapes in the Altiplano of Salta in Argentina, this stuff becomes a lot harder to do. And these days, much of the sort of the religious practices, Steiner, one of his famous claims is there's a special preparation that you need to spray on your vines. And the way you do that is you prepare a mixture and then you bury it in a cow horn. And to Steiner's point of view, if the cow horn doesn't come from a cow on your property, it won't work. So I'm always curious when people tell me they're biodynamic, where are the cows? Where's the cow with only one horn? Somehow the concept of Steiner creating this completely independent ecosystem within the farm falls a little short of reality. The current organization that supervises most things biodynamic is called the Demeter Organization, named for the goddess of the harvest. And they provide the mixtures. You don't have to make the mixture and bury it in a cow horn. They send you the mixture and you spray it on your vines. And if you do everything according to their guidelines, they will then certify you as biodynamic. But of course, the mere fact that you're buying these chemicals, or rather organic preparations, I need to be careful, you are buying these organic preparations from outside your farm's ecosystem implies that maybe you're not following the same idealistic guidelines of Rudolf Steiner. I have heard any number of winemakers tell me, well, yeah, we meet the standards of Demeter. I'm not sure that the practices themselves necessarily give us better fruit, for example, but they do require us to spend more time in the vineyard, and that alone produces better fruit. One of the most memorable conversations I had about this was a grower in Priorat in Catalonia, and the owner of the vineyard was a young man. He and his wife were biochemists who had left the aeronautical engineering world to come back to their grandparents' farm and grow their fruit. And he said, Paul, I am perfectly aware that a 747 flying over this vineyard on its way to land in Barcelona has more of a gravitational pull on my vineyard than the planet Jupiter. But I also know that if I follow all the biodynamic guidelines, I get really great fruit. And that's good enough for me, especially if by getting that great fruit, I can also certify with Demeter that I am biodynamic and give an added value to the product. So that seemed to me like a pretty rational explanation of biodynamics. Let's move on to a whole other area of the future. Let's talk about packaging. Boy, is the world wide open to new opportunities in terms of packaging. You know, I give my students at Napa Valley College a challenge each year. I ask them to define all of the purposes of a wine bottle. Yeah, it's to carry the wine. It's to protect the wine against heat. It's to protect the wine against light, against air. It's to make a good seal with the cork. It's to present the label. It is in some cases to a serving container, a shipping container, a marketing and presentation container. Sometimes the bottle actually indicates the region. So all of these characteristics come down to, or all of these criteria come down to, that's why we use a wine bottle. And then the question I ask them is, so if we went to the design divisions at MIT and Caltech and said, we need something that will do all of these things for wine, would they come up with the glass bottle and the cork stopper? And of course the answer is probably not. They'd come up with a lot of different things that would work better. But tradition is powerful in the world of wine, and that's why we use them. Within that traditional system, there are a couple of new developments or growing developments, and then there are a bunch of systems that are not within that tradition. First of all, let's talk about closures. A closure system for a wine bottle is really all about oxygen management. As wine ages, ideally it will absorb tiny, and I do mean tiny, amounts of oxygen. With a cork, this oxygen usually comes from the cells of the cork. But that oxygen is then absorbed by the sulfur dioxide that's in the wine. Normally occurs during fermentation, and then most companies add a little sulfur at the end to increase the protection against too much oxidation. And then each one of these closures has a different level of oxidation. So you've got your normal corks, agglomerated corks, which are just those little pieces of cork all glued together into a tube. Then you've got twin discs, where it's a tube of that agglomerated cork, and on each end there's a little disc of solid cork. Lots of different options in terms of how you buy corks. All of those corks have one thing in common, which is that they do make a relatively tight seal against the bottle, very good, and they do tend to leak very small amounts of oxygen out of the cork into the wine, which, if you understand the process and you understand the rate of that process, you can adjust your sulfur, and they are pretty effective. They do, however, require a very special tool just to remove them from the bottle. And this is something that the wine industry has talked about for a couple of generations. We are the only consumer product that requires our consumers to go out and buy a special tool just so they can enjoy our product. Synthetic corks, aka plastic corks or plastic stoppers. The truth is that the very good versions of synthetic corks that are the highest tech synthetic corks perform very much the way natural cork stoppers do. Unfortunately, they are also every bit as expensive as cork stoppers. Of course, the big bugaboo with natural cork stoppers is a certain percentage of those, and there have been variations over the years. Now I guess it's down to 1%, 2%, or 3%, but years ago it was up to, some people quoted as high as 10%. Of those corks are flawed with TCA, a moldy smell. Synthetic corks don't have the moldy smell. But synthetic corks also, at competitive prices, particularly for large production lots of wine, probably leak more oxygen and in a less controlled manner than natural corks. So the challenge here is, if you're making an inexpensive wine and you're pretty sure that wine is going to be bottled, put out on the shelf, and consumed within 4 to 6 months, synthetic corks are absolutely a viable option and will have a lower incidence, much lower incidence of any sort of taint. The minute you start asking your synthetic corks to do a little more than that, the answer is they probably won't perform as well as natural corks. But again, 90+% of all the wine in the world is consumed within 24 hours of purchase. So how important is it that your cork or your stopper last for a year or two? And then we have screw caps. Screw caps are in some ways the best closure in that they allow the least amount of oxygen into the bottle. But that means that wineries using screw caps need to use less sulfur in their wines, because if they use more sulfur and it doesn't get the oxygen, The sulfur, in which case, doesn't interact with oxygen. In fact, it becomes hydrogen sulfide, smells like rotten eggs, or in the worst cases, mercaptans. And these days, particularly when you open a young screw cap bottle of wine, you will frequently find a little bit of a garbagey, rotten egg smell, at least in the first few minutes. As you aerate the wine, unlike cork taint, which does not go away with aeration, the hydrogen sulfide in wine usually blows off. It's called reduction. And it usually disappears in the glass. So if you smell a little bit, don't panic, swirl it a little bit and think, maybe it'll get better in a couple of minutes. Screw caps, again, one of the big challenges for consumers. They look at screw caps and they say, oof, this is an inexpensive wine. Now, that's true in North America. In Australia, in New Zealand, 90% of the wine in the country is bottled with alternative closures, either screw caps or even bag-in-a-box, and nobody complains. So it's clearly a cultural issue. It's not a technical issue. One small danger with screw caps is if you drop a bottle from even a very low height and it lands on that cap, the little ring on the top of the bottle may break the seal. So they are a little more fragile that way in terms compared to natural corks. But in general, if you had to tell me I needed to produce 1 million bottles of wine and every single one of them had to be as consistent as possible, and you were going to open them up 2 years later and test them, the screw cap would do that more effectively than the natural cork. The challenge of corks to that is, as we all know, when you're serving in a restaurant, when you've got the wine on the shelf, people looking at a screw cap will look at it and say, okay, I'm going to spend less money on this because it has a screw cap. It's nonsensical, but we're talking about human behavior. It is nonsensical. And then the last one, actually, perhaps the most expensive, are these wonderful little glass stoppers. I'm sure you've seen them. That they use the same basic seal that a screw cap does. It's a little plastic ring inside the glass stopper, but they fit very snugly to the glass. They're machined in there, so they fit perfectly. They fit tight. They can be reused more or less like a screw cap. But they haven't taken off primarily because they're pretty expensive and they are recyclable. You take off the plastic ring and toss them in your recycling. But so far they haven't really taken off, and I suspect they won't they won't really take off except at a very top end for a few wineries. And now let's talk about the bottle. Since we've talked about the cork or the closure, now let's talk about the bottle. You know, the original wine bottle came in 3 shapes and 4 colors. You had your Bordeaux, your Burgundy, or your Hock, right? And you had 4 colors. You had clear, you had bright green, you had what's called dead leaf green, that sort of yellowish, brownish green, and then you had brown. And that pretty much encapsulated every single bottle in the world of wine today. But we're seeing perhaps a little more innovation there. Certainly what happened 15 years ago is people started going to a heavier bottle because, of course, like heavier silverware in a restaurant, a heavier glass bottle feels like quality. People associate quality with weight. So the heavier the bottle, the more quality the wine. On the other hand, consumers who are concerned about the environment, about global climate change, recognize these heavier bottles are not nearly as energy efficient because they cost more to transport, they cost more to make, and they are basically an unnecessary, a needless waste of our unsustainable resources. So with that, heavier bottles have come into a fair amount of criticism from some sides, and yet at the same time there are any number of luxury wineries that say, oh, we would never bottle in anything else. The counterpoint to this is there are now wineries who are moving to a much lighter bottle. Torres has been a world leader in this, where they've actually worked with glass companies to come up with a bottle that simply uses less glass and weighs less. And it's perfectly successful. God bless them. So there is a way to reduce carbon emissions. There's a way to reduce the amount of glass we actually need. It's a good solution, but of course Torres, being a big international brand, might be able to afford to do this, but at the same time, despite the fact that they make some superlative wines, it is a rare wine writer who, when asked to name the 10 most fabulous and wonderful and elegant wines in the world, mentions a Torres wine. And that's too bad, because they do make wonderful wines. There are plastic bottles for wine. Of course, you've seen them in airlines, where weight is always at a premium. I use them for my backpacking trips, where weight is really at a premium. But plastic bottles, just like, again, they use a screw cap, so they have the same challenges of screw caps. When people see a plastic bottle and they pick it up, they think cheap wine. Even though the wine inside the bottle could be quite high quality, that's not the perception that we get. And of course, marketing is always a battle of perceptions, not products. The last category is proprietary bottles. And you heard me talk about this with the liqueurs and cocktails in one of my previous lectures. First of all, there are regions who have proprietary bottles, and the one that immediately comes to mind is Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which has, of course, embossed, or rather debossed, on the bottle the keys of St. Peter, the symbol of the Pope, because of course Châteauneuf-du-Pape is, or was, the home of the Pope for a while there in the 1300s. So they use that bottle, and you know automatically the minute you see that bottle, even if it has no label on it, even if it's been through the flood and all the labels have washed off, this is Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And there are not only regions that do this, but now, obviously, starting with Dom Perignon and a few other wines, there are individual wineries that use a proprietary bottle for their product. So alternative bottling solutions, there are a ton of things, just talking about glass and, in this case, a little bit of screw top plastic. Lots of areas where we can grow, lots of areas where we can change. Let's see if that happens. Because there are other solutions. Bag-in-the-box, and this is again just a plastic diaphragm inside a cardboard box. They are extremely effective for storing wine. Not for long periods of time. You don't want to age a bag-in-a-box wine 20 years. But again, most wine is consumed relatively quickly, and for example, a huge percentage of wine in Australia is sold bag-in-the-box, because if you're having a glass of wine per night or 2 glasses per night, it is absolutely much friendlier to the environment. It's all 100% recyclable. It doesn't use glass. It weighs so much less than the equivalent number of bottles, so it's much quicker and easier to ship and lighter to ship. And because the diaphragm inside actually collapses as you pull the wine out, no air ever gets into contact with the wine. So the 4th, 5th, and 6th glasses, even if you drink them 3 days later, are absolutely as unoxidized as the first glass. This is a perfect solution for drinking wine on a regular basis. In the USA, it is now a significant category, but it's dominated by a few major players, Black Box being one of them, where they've taken the entire concept upscale, and they're selling you, I think it's 4 bottles of wine in a bag-in-a-box for an upscale price, but it's still less than buying 4 bottles of the same wine in glass, assuming you can find exactly the same wine, simply because of the packaging costs and the shipping costs are less. So, interesting idea. Will wine ever lose that elitist element in the USA, so that bag-in-the-box becomes something that we have in every household? I'm not sure. I think we're still tied very much to the British sense that wealthy nobility, upper class people drink wine out of glass bottles, and lower class, working class people drink beer, and bag-in-the-box falls someone in the middle and confuses everybody. And of course, there's the original wine packaging, which is the goat skin. This is the Bota bag. Although there are wineries that have experimented with this. Cliff Family Cellars had made a wine for a while called the Cliffhanger, which came complete with a carabiner. And the idea was it was the perfect grab-and-go packaging material. If you wanted to go camping, backpacking, etc., you could just grab one of these basically a plastic Bota bag, and take it on the trail with you, in your canoe, out on the beach. no worries about glass, no worries about anything else. And it was focused on those young, active wine drinkers. Wine was actually pretty good inside the bag, but in the end, I think they ran into enough resistance or not enough enthusiastic endorsement that I believe the program has been pretty severely curtailed there. Always a chance to bring it back in the right conditions. And then this is something that I think is really quite fascinating, the keg, because this is a very successful way to sell wine into restaurants. Restaurants really love this. It's extremely environmentally friendly because the kegs are not only recyclable, they're reusable. So you build a keg once and you never have to build it again. They are heavy to ship, but compared to the weight of glass bottles, they are actually competitive on that level as well. They are just like bag-in-the-box in terms of every single glass that comes of wine that comes out of the keg tastes the same, so very consistent. You never have that problem in restaurants where, yes, I'd like the Vino Nobile de Montepulciano by the glass, and they go pull you the bottle, and it turns out you're the first person in 4 days to have ordered that wine, and a half-open bottle. That wine's been sitting on the back bar now for 4 days, and it doesn't taste good. Kegs solve all of those problems. There is no problem at the end of the shift of throwing out the half bottles of wine because we can't save them for tomorrow. It's a superb delivery system. Restaurants are already used to the idea of hooking up kegs for beer, so the idea of hooking up a keg for wine, it's a no-brainer for them. The biggest challenges here are that for the consumer, there is no brand recognition. Now, if we're dealing with a buy-the-glass program, it can be argued that the consumer never sees the label anyway. But in some restaurants, they will bring the bottle out, show it to you, and then pour it. So you don't get brand visibility, you don't get label recognition from a keg. On the other hand, you get a superb delivery system, and isn't that what you want? Well, let's see if somebody in the future comes up with a way that you can get both of these things at the same time. And then our last of all is the can. A can of wine. Seems strange to say that. Used to be a comedian joke. No, I drink the best wine I can get as long as it comes in a can. Ha 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 ha. But Sofia Coppola changed all that. She bottled her sparkling wine in a can, and amusingly, I think, but perceptively, she included in each one of those cans there was a little straw. And when you open the can, the straw popped up, and as Sophia explains it, that's because she was so tired of having a drink in a bar and then having to redo her lipstick all the time because she kept rubbing a glass up against her lips, and this straw allowed her to drink her sparkling wine without messing up her lipstick. That's putting the customer first. It's now a growing segment of the market, and while it may not be considered upscale on one level, on the other level, wine cans are not sold in fine wine shops in downtown Manhattan, but they are often sold in pool areas, on the beach where glass is forbidden, in which case a can of wine is still an upscale choice over beer or other things. So the marketing here is primarily focused on what we call glass-free environments. So beaches, pools, places where you really don't want to have broken glass for any reason. Now let's talk about another way the wine world may change in the future, and that's how we make it and how we distribute it. And I have quite a long list here. Let's go through it and talk about how the wine world is changing. And the first one, of course, is custom crush. Winemaking equipment is incredibly cash intensive. It's very expensive to buy all that stainless steel machinery, and you use it for about 4 weeks a year, and then it sits there for the rest of the year. So some wine facilities have opened up and said, listen, we only use this equipment 14 hours a day. If you can use it for the other 10 hours a day, we'll rent it to you. And as long as your grapes don't conflict with our grapes, we'll make wine for you, and you can have all the glamour and all the glory of owning your own wine brand and not have the expense of owning a winery. So who needs a winery or a vineyard? People are now, as I'm quite sure you know, famous vineyards like To Kalon, owned by Andy Beckstoffer, at least part of it. That vineyard sells grapes to any number of very high-end wineries that get some of the highest rankings of any wines on the planet. And some of those wines are made not in their own winemaking facility, but in a custom crush facility. So it is absolutely possible to make great wine and famous wine in a custom crush facility, basically from grapes you don't own, in a winery you don't own, and yet the brand you own, and it's very expensive and it's very successful. On the other side of things, what if you make wine and you decide to sell it not under your own label, but under someone else's label? One of my ex-employees, a guy years ago who worked for me, eventually started a wine company, and for a while all he did was call on major distributors and major retailers and ask them this question: why are you building someone else's brand when you could build your own? So he would give them that challenge. He would say, you tell me what you want in a wine. You tell me what you want it to taste like, what the label should look like. You tell me everything you want in a wine and a price point, and I'm going to come back and deliver exactly what you're asking for. You can then sell that in your stores, and the profit margin will be much more because you own the brand. It's a very effective marketing scheme, and he made enough money in that business to basically and ultimately buy his own winery, where he now makes wine pretty much like everybody else, so kind of funny there. But certainly this is a major development over the last 10 years in the world of wine, is whether it be Trader Joe's, whether it be the 5-cent sale at Bevmo or Total Wine's special products. These are wines, a lot of these wines are made specifically for them. Not to say that they start with, let's go look at that vineyard. Instead, they start with, we need a wine like this. And wineries are asked to submit samples based on blends they can make with bulk wine out in the world. Some of it is bulk wine that they make in their own wineries, and some of it is bulk wine that they buy on the bulk market and then produce. So lots of different ways to do this. And for example, in Europe, most of the big chain markets have a certified enologist on staff, and one of their jobs is to go around to the various co-op wineries in Europe and put together their own blends and bring them in as their own products. So is that custom crush, or is that custom label? It seems like a little bit of both. And then the last category here originally applied just for major chain markets. A winery might be asked by someone like, whether it be an airline or whether it be Marriott Hotels, we'd like you to make a Cabernet and we want your name on it. We want the bottles to say, bottled exclusively for Marriott Hotels. Don't know if Marriott, don't quote me on that, but some hotels, some restaurant chains certainly have done that. Now, having said that, then the question is, okay, fair enough. If you're Olive Garden and you want to have a wine made for you and you're going to sell 8,000 cases over the next year, most wineries will talk to you about that. But then how small do you go on that? If you're just a single restaurant in Davis, California, can you call up a winery and say, I want a wine like this? Well, with a big winery, probably not. With smaller wineries, there's still that option. And of course, ultimately, we get down to the point where there are individual wineries, relatively small wineries, who will tell you, if you buy a case or 2 cases of this wine, we will allow you to put your own private label on the wine. So that takes this big concept of let's make a brand for Kroger's and change that down to, let's sell Paul Wagner a case of his own wine, and each bottle will have a special label that says bottled, selected by, and bottled exclusively for Paul Wagner. And some people like that. I don't have very many of those bottles, but some people like it. Now let's move on to what really constitutes a winery, because if you don't own vineyards and you're using custom crush to make your wine, that's a virtual winery. And again, as we've said, some of those, there are some of the biggest, or at least the highest priced wines in the world that follow that example. But the other solution, or another solution, San Antonio Winery, years and years ago, figured this out very quickly. What they saw was, if you open a winery, you are allowed 1 tasting room on the premises, on the bonded premises of the winery. So you get a tasting room at the winery. It's up to you to negotiate with the county how that's open. So, for example, in Napa County, most of them are open by appointment only. But in Los Angeles County, San Antonio Winery had a plan where they could open at will, 24. I mean, not 24 hours a day, but they were open to the public and something like 12 hours a day. Then they started opening more wineries, and all you have to do to create a winery is create a bonded facility. So they would take over retail shops, they would take over bars, and they would transform a small section in the back to a bonded winery. All they had to do was bring in a couple barrels of wine and store it there for a while to prove that they were making wine at this facility, and then that allowed them another tasting room. So at one point they had 20, 25 tasting rooms sprinkled around Los Angeles, which were essentially wine bars. The challenge, of course, is that when you're a single winery and you do this, the only wines you can offer in your wine bar are the wines you make. And eventually, the wines they made fell out of fashion. They pretty much closed up. There may be a few of these still open. I think maybe one or two. But the modern expression of that is wineries that are opening what are called remote tasting rooms. You're allowed one tasting room away from your bonded facility. Remote tasting rooms on Cannery Row in Monterey, in downtown San Francisco at Pier 39, in downtown Napa, because of course downtown Napa does not have the same restrictions in terms of the agricultural preserve that the county does. The county says any new wine tasting rooms are by appointment only. The city says, come on down, we want your business. So lots of different ways to dance around this. And then, of course, you have wineries like City Winery, which opened up as a winery combination restaurant, bar, and nightclub, where they were not only making wine, but then in addition to that, they were offering all those other services as part of their winery operations in the city. And you have other companies that are offering to make wines specifically for you. The permitting issues are major here, but that's why, for example, these tasting rooms are opening in Napa and not in the county, because the city of Napa does not have the same permitting concerns that the county does. And there is one little note I'd like to point out here, is that if you own a microbrewery, part of the ABC licensing process for a microbrewery allows you to sell other alcoholic products as part of your microbrewery. So open a microbrewery, and that automatically allows you to sell wine and liquor. Now those permits, those licenses are quite expensive in most areas, but microbrew licenses are not. So it's a little way to dance around the system, and we're beginning to see that happen as well. Now we have crowdfunding. The biggest example of that, of course, is, as I point out on the slide, Naked Wines. But Naked Wines is a corporate concept which says what we're going to do is get people to invest in the idea of winemakers making wines and selling them directly back to our members at a reduced price. They're very clever marketers. They're very effective at how they do this. And so they've been pretty successful at this. Basically what they do is they create the wine club first, and then they sell the wine club the wine. Other winemakers have been doing this for a long time, and for example, Chalone, many years ago, was a publicly traded company, and when they would have a shareholders meeting, it would be a party at the winery, and all of the shareholders showed up, and part of the dividend to the shareholders was they received both the party and some wine. So there are different ways to design this, different ways to create this, but the idea of getting your customers involved in your winery more deeply, literally from the beginning at the funding element, is certainly something that we can look forward to in the future as well. I have a dear friend who basically built her winery by reaching out to the many people she knew across the wine club and offering them the opportunity to become founding members of her winery. And she was hoping to get enough for the down payment of a winery, and enough people participated. They almost paid for the entire winery construction. And what they got in return was some signed magnums that were unavailable to the rest of the public. They were invited to a private party at the winery once it was open to celebrate it. So they got some money back for their contribution, but in the meantime, she got the cash she needed to build a winery. Another way we're selling wine here is from an expert source. Now, this is a very ancient tradition. This goes back to the days of individual wine merchants in Europe seeking out specific producers and then bringing in horse-drawn wagons their wines into market. In fact, there is considerable evidence that the word sommelier originally comes from a French word sommelier, and that is a wagon driver, so someone who delivers wine to the restaurant. Barton Guestier, which still exists today in a limited form, as does Harvey's. These were both companies that built their reputations first on by our name, and we will find all the wines you want. The most famous for Harvey's, of course, was their Bristol Cream, and of course Bristol Cream was a sherry that they imported, and they imported in different blends from Spain, and when it got to Harvey's in Bristol, in the UK, they would then put together the final blend and sell it to the public. So this is a combination of an importer and ultimately a blender and a distributor of the same product. Barton Guestier would tell you that they were your French wine merchant, and they would find wines all over France and bring them to you that were the best value for the money and the best quality and all the rest. There is another wine shop in France called Nicolas who makes much the same promise even today. In this country, maybe the founder of this concept was a guy by the name of Frederick Wildman, who traveled around Europe, and every bottle that he sold, remember our example of the Nabiscos, every bottle that Frederick Wildman sold had a neck label across the top that said Frederick Wildman Selection. So what you were buying was not only a beautiful bottle of wine from Burgundy or the Rhine, but you were buying a bottle that had the personal endorsement of Frederick Wildman. Now, how did those labels get stuck on there? I think that goes back to the, if you buy enough wine, will they stick your name on the label? A really good example of this in California is Kermit Lynch, who is a retail wine shop in Berkeley, but he also sells his wines through the distribution network to other restaurants and retailers, and he has spent an entire career traveling around the world to those lesser known regions in Europe, finding unique and interesting wines and bringing them back. And again, every single one of those wines at one point or another would have right there on the label Kermit Lynch wines in Berkeley, because he wants people to know he personally endorses every bottle he brings into the United States. Very interesting guy, wrote a wonderful book about wine. I think it's called Adventures in the Wine Trade. Well worth a visit to his shop. He does a beautiful job of merchandising his wines. A real icon in the world of wine. And then years ago, brand may still exist, although I suspect it's lost most of its glitz, was a company called Marcus James, and their absolute premise was, we are going to find the best wines for you around the world and bring them to you at an inexpensive price. And I remember, for example, when I worked on a project for them maybe 15 years ago, they had a Malbec from Argentina. They had, I can't remember, it's something unusual from Brazil. They had a red wine from Italy. And the concept was, we travel around the world so you don't have to. We find these wines so you don't have to. So at the very low end, that's a concept. And even at the very high end, some of the wines from Kermit Lynch are quite expensive. You have this opportunity of creating a brand around your expertise. And one last little way to sell wine that I think is quite interesting, this all evolved years and years ago. Of course, you would have the winemaker dinner. Robert Mondavi made a living off of winemaker dinners. In every city he would go to a local restaurant and say, I'll chip in for the cost of the wine. You sell the food. We'll get a bunch of people here, and I'll tell them how great the Napa Valley is and how great wines can be, and what a wonderful guy Robert Mondavi is. And it's what built the brand of Robert Mondavi. So these winemaker dinners around the country, very simple to organize, not so easy to execute sometimes, but at least from Robert Mondavi's point of view, this was one of the primary ways he met the world of the American consumer. And it's what made him and his brand what it was when he was in charge. From there, you go to a private tasting at a club. Cakebread Cellars for years has done private tastings for the MBA programs at top universities around the country, where he goes in and he talks about his wine and he does the Robert Mondavi thing, but he also gives MBA students that opportunity to know about wine, to learn about wine, to feel a little more confident in the world of wine. And oh, by the way, if you want to buy some, I've got some here. So take that and combine that with the concept of the Tupperware party, because that's actually what Pieroth does. Now, this is a company that it's all, they have proprietary wines. They don't sell anybody else's wines. But what they encourage you as a consumer to do is host a wine tasting party at your house. And when you host this wine tasting party at your house, they will send a representative, charming, funny, entertaining, and knowledgeable. They will send a selection of their wines, which are generally German and generally sweet and generally popular. And they will then basically organize a home wine tasting party, the end of which is everybody fills out an order blank and orders the wines they want to buy. And of course, there's no spitting allowed at these. By the time you've tasted through 6 or 8 wines, gosh, are you willing to try some of these and have them sent to your house? That's just great. It's still going, and it started 30, 40 years ago, still going strong today. And then, of course, thanks to coronavirus, we now have the opportunity for you to be in your home and either drive to the liquor store and call in your order and pick it up, or even have it delivered to your house in some destination. So all of these new ways to sell wine, will they become more common? Remember that Amazon a few years ago really tried very hard to figure out how they could deliver alcohol to a home across the country, not just in selected states. And eventually that will happen, I'm convinced, and we will be able to sit in our homes and order the wines we want delivered to our homes. Naked Wines delivers everything to your home. So where do we go from here? That's a great question. The one thing I can guarantee you is it ain't going to stay the same. We will see all sorts of surprises. We will see some of these things really take off. We'll see others that flap their wings really, really hard. You can always be sure anytime in the wine industry, any innovation comes forward, a bunch of people will write about it because there are so few of them. And when there is a legitimate innovation, everyone will say, ooh, gosh, we've got to write about this. This is actual news. But then in the end, it's relatively few of them that really take off in a big way. If you talk to the people with the little glass stoppers, they would have told you 10 years ago, we're on the cusp of something really big. They're still on the cusp of something really big. Bag in the Box, 5 years ago, people were saying it's the new big explosion. It hasn't exploded. It's still there. It still functions. It has its fans. But that classic marketing process from going from the early adopter to the mass market in wine just seems to be a really big step. And it's really hard for any innovation or company to make that next big step, to go from this is new and interesting and fun and different to, and now this is the way everybody is going to get their wine. So hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope you enjoyed the class, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with, because I hope you will provide some of the best surprises of the future. Thanks.